Welcome to the Alien Dusk. Let's start the story. Above the stratosphere, the stars fractured into streaks of fire. Commander Virell's vessel buckled, its sleek hull trembling under pressures it had never been built to endure. Alarms shrieked in harmonic pitches tuned to Terexari auditory nerves, soothing under normal circumstances. Not now. The atmosphere clawed at the ship like a beast awoken. A friction burn ignited along the belly of the diplomatic cruiser as it tore through the sky, trailing smoke and ionized metal like a wounded comet. Earth, a primitive orb of carbon and contradiction, unremarkable until now. Inside, holographic panels convulsed with erratic data streams. Red glyphs smeared across the curved display as the ship's AI, Virell, cycled through impossible diagnostics. Life support stuttered. Navigation blinked in and out. Artificial gravity spasmed, throwing Virell against the restraint field hard enough to rupture a vessel in her jaw. Blood, thinner and silver, pooled at the corner of her mouth. Sabotage. The thought cut through the chaos like a blade through vapor. It wasn't the Earth's atmosphere tearing the ship apart. It was an override. Something had reached into the core systems, unraveling the diplomatic fail-safes and disarming the warp dampeners. She tried to speak, to demand a manual lockout, but the command interface collapsed mid-sentence, replaced by a glyph she hadn't seen since her military years. Fail-safe compromised, initiating survival descent. "No!" she hissed, claws digging into the control interface. "Override! Virell, Commander, Class 9 diplomatic." But Earth did not care for rank. The gravity held no regard for alien design. The ship convulsed once more, the energy coils venting plasma like arterial spray. Below, jagged snow-covered peaks grew with terrifying speed. Sensors flickered. Trexari optics translated what they could. Dense forest, subterranean bunkers, glacial water reservoirs, all far too advanced for what intelligence suggested of Earth's frontier. And yet there it was. Heat signatures clustered underground, hidden beneath camouflage nets and sensor-dampening lattices. A fortress pretending to be wilderness. She braced. The impact would not be instant. That was the cruelty of Earth's grasp. It made them fall slow. Long enough to think, to wonder what had gone wrong, who had betrayed her, and whether these humans, these myths with their savage politics and unpredictable compassion, would finish what the sabotage began. The mountains rushed to meet her, then fire. Silence. Thick, absolute. The kind that follows cataclysm. Then pain. Deep, blooming, alive. Virell's vision returned in fragments. Cracked lens filters distorted light into chaotic prisms. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale slicing through her ribs like molten wire. Biogel surged through punctured seams in her suit, trying to mend what her ship's violent descent had undone. Somewhere behind her, the cockpit's hull still hissed with failing containment. Earth's air was heavier than she remembered, denser, colder. She pushed herself up, talons scraping carbon-scored alloy, and found herself staring into unfamiliar geometry, structures that didn't belong to her ship. The cockpit had split open on impact, half swallowed by snow and ice, and beyond the broken edge loomed shadows, tall, still, and watching. Figures emerged from the tree line with eerie precision, armor dark as void stone, visors blank, movements crisp and silent. Not the chaos of tribal brutes she'd expected. These humans moved like predators, coordinated, controlled. Not one flinched at the sight of the downed alien craft or its bleeding pilot. Their weapons were strange, not energy-based, no heat plumes, no kinetic signatures she recognized. Just matte barrels and glowing indicators wrapped in polymerized sheaths. Practical, efficient, ugly, in a way that suggested purpose over pride. One of them stepped forward, a female by bone structure. Her hand lifted, making a signal Virell's translator struggled to identify. A command, maybe, or a warning. In response, the others fanned out, establishing a perimeter around the wreckage. Still no words, no threats, just cold, alien eyes behind mirrored glass. Virell coughed. The blood came up black this time. Nanites in her bloodstream had failed to stabilize the internal rupture. Time was slipping. But it wasn't fear that filled her chest. It was disorientation, the gnawing dread of unpredictability. This wasn't how Earth was meant to be. Primitive, panicked, hostile. Yet here they were, disciplined, silent, already scavenging the wreck with surgical precision. She was surrounded by an unknown enemy, wearing the mask of calm, and not one of them looked surprised. Crunching snow announced his arrival. The others parted as he approached. Tall, broad-shouldered, face carved by years and frost. His uniform bore no ornamentation, save for a patch marked with a single worn emblem, a clawed gauntlet gripping a fractured star. No rank, no name, just presence. He stopped at the threshold of her wreckage, boots sinking into the snow-stained crater. The cold wind pulled at the hem of his coat, but he stood unmoved, gaze fixed on Virell with a focus that made her skin crawl. Something about him radiated stillness, not the passive kind, but the kind found in predators before the pounce. Her breathing hitched as her neural array tried and failed to scan him. No biofeedback, no encryption signature, just static. The sensors she trusted most responded with an error that translated to a single, infuriating word: unknown. He wasn't afraid, not even curious in the way scientists often were. He looked at her the way battlefield surgeons looked at wounds, calculating, detached. And then he spoke. His voice was low, coarse with cold air and disuse, yet unmistakably clear. Not a question, not a threat, a statement. Her translator filtered the phonemes and dialect within milliseconds, but even the machine hesitated at the undertone. He was asserting control, not requesting terms. She rose slowly, defiantly, though her legs trembled beneath the surface of her armor. Pain lanced up her spine, but she welcomed it. Pain was grounding. Pain made her dangerous. Their eyes locked, alien and human, predator and anomaly. Neither moved. Around them, soldiers held position, uncertain whether the tension was diplomatic or preluding violence. Virell couldn't tell either. The man had said so little, but in that silence, something had shifted. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't impressed, terrified, or curious. He was ready. Ready for her, as though he had expected someone like her to fall from the sky. And for the first time since the crash, Virell didn't know what to say. The walls of the subterranean compound hummed with quiet authority. Concrete and steel, old materials, but wielded with purpose. Screens glowed with schematics and biometric overlays as human technicians scrolled through protocols that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. She sat upright now, her wounds sealed by rudimentary but effective human medtech. Terexary pride snarled at the foreign nanite mesh stitching her flesh. Coarse, inefficient, yet infuriatingly functional. She watched the humans through half-lidded eyes, feigning disinterest as they worked, but her thoughts boiled beneath the surface. The man, Elias Ward, as she'd learned, stood nearby, reviewing a terminal with a stern-faced woman who smelled like voltage and suspicion. They spoke in hushed tones. Then came a phrase that hit harder than any impact. It's real. The Accord exists. Time stilled. She surged forward despite the protest of her healing muscles. Impossible, she growled, voice rough with disbelief. The Accord was myth. Propaganda used to frighten cadets into respecting dead empires. But the humans didn't laugh. They didn't question. They showed her. It was old, so old the digital text cracked like dried parchment, yet authenticated by a trinary code she recognized instantly. The crest of the Terexary High Triumvirate flickered beside a faded Earth emblem, a pre-unification symbol from a time before Earth's governments consolidated power. A clause buried deep in a forgotten treaty, one written in desperation during Earth's first contact war with rogue Terexary splinter factions. To save Earth from destruction, a human military envoy had been granted the right of claim over any surviving Terexary commander in exchange for peace. The logic had been primitive, the law ceremonial. Never meant to survive the century, but Earth had survived and it remembered. Her name had been cross-referenced with the Accord. Status confirmed, rank verified, and Elias Ward, descendant of the original envoy, was within legal right to invoke the clause. She stared at the text, mouth dry, unable to deny what her own people's code confirmed. It wasn't a threat, it was law. By the ancient agreement, she was bound to him, not as a prisoner, not as a diplomat, as a servant. The shame was instant and suffocating. "No," she whispered, barely audible. But Earth had already answered. She stood in the center of the briefing room, like a monument to fury, shoulders rigid, fists trembling. The screen still displayed the ancient accord, as if mocking her with the weight of history. Around her, soldiers moved with careful indifference, pretending not to listen. But the air had shifted. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Commander Virell was no stranger to defeat. But this was desecration. "I will not serve," she said, voice low and dangerous. "Better an honorable death than this. Humiliation." Across from her, Elias Ward met her fury with the calm of stone. He had not once raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. "I didn't write the law," he replied, "but I have to honor it. That's how peace survives." Peace. The word landed like a blade between her ribs. What did these humans know of peace? They built their empires on contradiction. Mercy in one hand, fire in the other. Virell stepped forward, towering in stature if not presence. "Then draw your weapon," she hissed. "Spare me the farce. Execute me. Let it be honest." Ward didn't flinch. "No." Her claws clicked open, a reflex of fury. "You deny me even death?" "I deny you cruelty," he said, "even if you can't." The silence that followed was colder than the wind outside. Her breath came faster, fury strangling her discipline. But beneath it, buried so deep she almost missed it, was something else. Confusion. Why wouldn't he kill her? Why bind himself to an alien, a political inconvenience, a liability? What possible value could she hold in this archaic arrangement? She had expected chains or death. Instead, she was offered a role. "Not a prisoner," Ward repeated. "Not property. You'll serve under my command, as an aide, an advisor." It was mercy, and it was worse than death. Her pride howled. Her culture demanded blood. But the law stood immutable, and Elias Ward, for reasons unfathomable, chose to uphold it with honor rather than cruelty. Virell looked away, jaw tight, voice barely a whisper. "Then I am by law." And somewhere in the back of her mind, a fracture began to form, not of loyalty, but of certainty, because this human had just defeated her without ever raising a weapon. The cold hadn't relented, and neither had she. 3 days passed, 3 days of silence laced with friction. Virell moved through the human base like a ghost in armor, every step measured, every gesture deliberate. The soldiers gave her wide berth, not out of fear, but something more unsettling: respect. It was too quiet, too calm, like standing on the skin of a frozen lake and hearing the deep groan of the ice below. Elias Ward had not revoked her service. He had not apologized for it either. He gave orders, concise, clean, and she followed them. Not out of obedience, but because defiance would serve no strategic value. That was what she told herself. Today, the field briefing was simple. Recon sweep along the forested perimeter of the mountain range, searching for possible signal interference points from the crash. Human scouts reported faint anomalies, likely tech fragments. Elias assigned Virell to lead the forward analysis team. They expected protest. She gave none. Out among the frost-bitten trees, she worked. Her senses were sharper than theirs. Terexari biointerfaces absorbed environmental data at a cellular level. She triangulated signal residue from her downed ship in half the time it would have taken their scanners. The humans watched her move, quiet murmurs behind her back, not knowing whether to be impressed or afraid. She didn't speak to them, but Elias noticed. He monitored the team's movements through a tactical uplink, and though his face gave nothing away, his voice over comms was different now. Less command, more consideration. "Good work, Commander." She flinched at the title. It was the first time he'd said it. Later, back at the outpost, their paths crossed again in the command corridor. "You didn't have to do so well," he said quietly. She turned, arms folded. "I don't do things halfway. Even servitude." That earned her a faint flicker in his expression. Amusement, Or something more dangerous? Suit yourself, he said, and moved on. But in that moment, brief and brittle as frost, something changed. Not trust, not yet, but curiosity. A glint of mutual recognition between two creatures forged by war and shaped by duty. Neither belonged here, not fully, yet here they were. Bound by law, divided by species, equal only in fire. And though neither would admit it, the war between them had already begun. The archives beneath Geneva were older than most remembered. Long before unification, before the orbital citadels and planetary defense grid, Earth had nearly torn itself apart, not from alien invasion, but from itself. Nations bled one another dry, drawing lines in soil that satellites would one day erase. It was in that chaos that humanity first glimpsed the stars and found something worse staring back. The first contact war hadn't been a war by Terexari standards. It had been a purge, a campaign by rogue fleets seeking glory and dominance over what they deemed a backwater species. The humans weren't ready, not technologically, not tactically, but they were relentless, and that terrified the stars. Records of that time were fragmented. Earth's data had survived through paranoia. The Trexaris had vanished under Imperial censorship. Commanders like Virell had never seen the full truth, just whispers passed down as cautionary myths, half-truths turned into political armor. But the truth lived in the dark corners of Earth's network. Legal doctrines buried under trillions of dead documents, parsed by AIs built to remember what humans were too afraid to forget. The treaty was rediscovered by accident. A pattern recognition algorithm caught the seal of the Terexari triumvirate, encoded in an archaic legal contract. It was dated 236 years ago, signed in desperation by Earth's surviving leaders and a Trexari diplomat whose name had been erased from every alien record. The clause was clear. If any Trexari aggressor were ever to engage Earth without provocation, they would be bound by service until the debt of honor was repaid. A debt measured not in years, but in consequence. If the human host accepted the accord, the aggressor would serve them, bound by interspecies law, upheld by the great codes of both empires. Virell read it twice. Her vision blurred. It wasn't just real, it was binding. Her people had written this treaty, not Earth, and in doing so, they had created a law that would now enslave her under the guise of tradition. What horrified her most wasn't that the humans had remembered it. It was that her empire had deliberately forgotten. She stood in Elias Ward's office like a soldier before a firing squad, spine straight, eyes burning. The treaty's text still echoed through her skull, heavy as iron and twice as cold. This wasn't defeat, it was worse. It was ritualized disgrace, sanctified by law. "I demand execution," she said, each word clipped and final. Elias looked up from the report. "You've said that." "Say it again then," she snapped. "Kill me. Strip this dishonor from my name before it rots the blood in my veins." He studied her for a long time. Not with condescension, worse, with understanding. "You think dying restores your honor," he said. "But to us, that's just quitting." Her jaw flexed, nostrils flaring. "You don't get to define honor for my people." "I'm not," he replied, voice steady. "But I'm not going to let you define peace for mine either." That silenced her. Earth Command had sent orders. Maintain the treaty. The diplomatic council, fractured as ever, feared the optics of dishonoring a legally ratified interstellar accord. There were whispers already. Other Turksari factions listening, watching, waiting for a crack. A blood-stained execution, no matter how justified, would be all they needed to call Earth a treaty breaker. Elias knew the game, knew the pressure, but this wasn't strategy anymore. It was her. "You don't deserve to die for something your empire forgot," he said, "and I won't be your executioner." Her fists clenched. "Then you would make me a slave." "Number, I'll make you a partner, bound by law, but treated with the dignity your own empire refused to remember." She turned away, ashamed of the sting in her chest. He didn't understand. He couldn't. Her people had died rather than bend the knee to tradition's blade. Yet here she stood, wrapped in the very shame they would have burned to avoid. And still he would not kill her. He had no weapon drawn, no threat in his voice. But Elias Ward was holding her in a vice stronger than steel. Mercy. and mercy was a prison from which honor could never escape. The datapad chirped its assignment code: routine diagnostics, language matrix calibration, foreign tech interface alignment. On paper, it read like a bureaucratic afterthought, but in reality, it marked something far more complex. Commander Virell was now officially assigned under Elias Ward as a contracted partner. The term, pulled directly from the dusty language of the treaty, sounded sterile, harmless, even civil. To her, it was poison wrapped in protocol. They didn't cage her, didn't shackle her limbs or lock her away in a cold cell. Instead, they gave her a workstation, access to Earth's linguistic database, and a direct uplink to the salvaged remains of her own ship. Her task? Bridge the gap between alien tech and human application, an act that, to her people, was little short of treason. Even worse, she was good at it. The human translation AI was primitive by Turksari standards: brute force logic, clumsy code stitching, and assumptions built on linear syntax. But it was clever, adaptive, like watching a child solve a puzzle blindfolded and still finding the edges. With a sigh, she fused one of her neural filaments into the uplink node. The biotech responded to her presence instantly, bioluminescent veins glowing along the interface like roots feeding light into stone. Within seconds, translation errors smoothed, signal delay vanished, contextual ambiguity dropped by 73%. One human technician let out a low whistle. Damn, she ignored him. Elias stood nearby, arms crossed, watching, not with arrogance, but with something harder to pin down: appreciation. She hated that. Every successful sync, every fixed glitch, pulled her deeper into the machinery of this place. They needed her, not as a prisoner, as a tool of peace. She told herself this wasn't cooperation, it was obligation, service demanded by ancient dishonor. But the line between duty and integration blurred with every system she repaired, every problem she solved. And in the silence that followed her work, Virell wondered, not for the first time, if peace was just another kind of war. One fought not with weapons, but with slow, surgical surrender. The simulation room was silent except for the faint hum of machinery, deceptively calm before the storm. Two figures stood before the digital map, staring at a holographic representation of an enemy base. Red dots scattered across the terrain like bloodstains. It was supposed to be a simple tactical exercise. In theory, a perfect chance for Virell to prove her strategic mind, her understanding of advanced warfare tactics, but nothing ever played out as expected when humans were involved. "You're overcomplicating the approach," Virell said, her voice sharp as she adjusted the holographic display. "If you send infantry on that flank, they'll be exposed. There's too much open ground. The AI sim doesn't account for human limitations in mobility." Elias didn't budge. "We don't have the kind of tech you do. Your people would rely on advanced stealth, speed, and power. Sure, but our infantry won't get that kind of support." "Then don't use infantry." She exhaled sharply, frustration tightening her throat. "Use the terrain. Force them into choke points. Don't just react. Outmaneuver them." "I'm trying to, but you're assuming we can ignore ground intelligence, which we can't. We need balance, not brute force. We're not all elite soldiers with bioenhancements." Her sharp, almost derisive laugh filled the room. "You mistake tactics for weakness, Elias. I'm not asking you to sacrifice soldiers. I'm asking you to be strategic. Look." She pulled the map closer, swiping through the interface with precision that nearly matched the machines. "We hit them here, here, and we shut down their primary defense system before they can retaliate." Elias eyed her, irritation flickering in his gaze. But something deeper, a simmering spark of curiosity, was there too. "It's not that simple," he said. "You think humans are incapable of handling a complex simulation? Of making tactical decisions?" "I think," Virell countered, "that humans are far too emotional to ever be truly effective. You prioritize personal sacrifice over strategic advantage. You make mistakes because you're driven by honor, not logic." There was a heavy pause. Elias stepped forward, his expression no longer guarded but open, challenging. "Then show me how it's done," he said, tone laced with challenge. "You think I'm emotionally driven? Let's test it. I'm not going to let you push me into a corner, Commander. Virell stared at him. This wasn't the cold, calculated leader she expected. This was someone who fought for something intangible, something beyond logic, something she had yet to fully understand. She narrowed her eyes, then tapped a sequence into the hollow interface. The simulation began to reconfigure, her fingers moving with a speed and certainty that left little room for doubt. For a moment, they were a perfect team, his human adaptability countering her brutal, efficient tactics. They almost failed. The Sim's battlefield lit up in red warnings as an unexpected countermeasure unfolded on the screen, nearly outsmarting both of them. Elias's jaw tightened, but he caught himself just in time. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Virell's lips twitched slightly. "I warned you," she said, but the edges of her voice softened. "Humans can't think like Trexari, but you do think." And that realization, small, buried under layers of pride and contempt, shifted something inside her. It was the first time she felt it. Not a human, not a machine, but a mind worth trusting. The hum of Earth's comm system was interrupted by a sharp crackle, followed by the familiar pulse of encrypted data. Virell stood at the console, her fingers poised over the controls, eyes narrowed as she read the intercepted transmission. It was coded in Terrasari, a pattern she'd once known like the back of her hand, but one that had long since turned to static in her mind. Yet here it was again, the language unmistakable. The chatter came in fragments, each piece revealing more than she wanted to hear. The voice, commanding, cold, spoke of her in the past tense. "Virell is dead, presumed lost. The battle for Earth will proceed without hesitation. Rally the fleets." The message sent an icy tremor through her chest. It had been days since her crash, days of quiet tension beneath the surface of Earth's fractured military machine. But this wasn't just a diplomatic oversight, it was something far more dangerous. A rallying cry. Elias walked into the room, eyes immediately locking onto the expression on her face. "What's wrong?" "I'm dead," she said flatly. Elias blinked, the weight of her words hitting him only after a long pause. "What do you mean?" She tapped the console, bringing up the intercepted message again, displaying it in full for him to see. "They think I died in the crash," she explained, "but my people don't forget. They've already started mobilizing the fleet. Warships are on their way." Elias's face hardened, his hand gripping the edge of the console. "We're that close?" "Yes." Virell's voice was like ice. "Their council is already moving. The factions closest to the capital won't wait. They'll launch before confirmation of my death reaches their ears." A heavy silence settled between them, the magnitude of the situation creeping into every corner of the room. Earth was on the verge of a crisis, one it was utterly unprepared for. Elias cursed under his breath, pulling up his own tactical displays. The human forces were nowhere near ready to face an entire Terexari fleet. Not in their current state. "Then we'll need to buy time," he said, his mind already racing through possible options. "We'll need to move fast." "I don't think time is on our side anymore," she said, her tone unyielding. "They'll come, whether we're ready or not." The thought of war, of her people coming, and humanity standing no chance, tugged at something deep inside her. A loyalty she didn't fully understand. The Trexari Empire wasn't hers anymore, not after the humiliation she'd suffered. But Earth, this fractured world where she had no right to feel at home, was now something else. A reluctant part of her wondered, could it be worth saving? Her mind flashed to the treaty again. Honor, duty, the ancient laws that had bound her. Her empire had abandoned her, yet this fractured world still had the courage to stand in defiance. But it would take more than courage to survive, and that meant for now, her survival and her strategy belonged to Earth. Virell stood at the heart of the war room, her gaze sharp, assessing the situation laid out before her. The holographic display flickered, showcasing the incoming fleet trajectory. A battle was imminent, and humanity had no idea how outmatched they were. "Recon suggests they'll hit us in 3 days," Elias said, his voice as calm as ever, though the tension in his posture was palpable. He tapped a few controls, adjusting the map. "If we can't slow them down..." We'll have no chance to stop them, Virell finished, her words cutting through the air like a knife. The humans, well-intentioned but tragically unprepared, had one advantage. They weren't afraid of the enemy. Not yet, but fear was a luxury that couldn't last long when faced with an empire of tertiary precision. Her fingers flew over the interface, recalculating the projected trajectory of the incoming fleet. Earth's forces were scattered, weakened, vulnerable. But she knew this game. She knew how her people thought. And with her insights, they could, at the very least, survive long enough to make a dent in their overwhelming numbers. She had nothing to gain here. No more honor to reclaim, no empire to return to. But the question nagged her. What if this was her last chance to fight for something worthwhile? Her eyes darted across the screen as new information flooded in. If she could anticipate their tactics, if she could throw off the Terexari's advanced predictive algorithms, they might buy humanity just enough time to pull off a surprise counterattack. Do you really think this will work? Elias asked, his tone skeptical, but not dismissive. I'm not here for your trust, she snapped, not looking up. I'm here because you need me. There it was again. Resentment, the sour taste of her own pride mixed with something else, something she refused to name. She needed them too, and that realization wasn't something she was ready to confront. Elias watched her closely, his eyes narrowing with calculation. There was no denying the fact that despite her role as a contracted partner, Virell had proven invaluable. It was strange to think that a being who had once towered over him in rank and knowledge, who had, only days ago, demanded an honorable death, was now offering solutions that could mean the difference between life and death for his people. You'll be leading the strategy brief, he said finally, his voice firm. But there's one condition. She raised an eyebrow, turning her head to meet his gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something other than disdain in her eyes. You'll follow orders, he added, voice unwavering. Not as a prisoner, as a member of this team. Virell's lips twitched in something between a smirk and a sneer. And if I refuse? If you refuse, Elias said with a quiet intensity, you'll prove the point that your honor was never worth a damn in the first place. She didn't reply. Didn't need to. The decision was made. She would work with him, not because it was right, but because survival demanded it. For a moment, the bitterness of servitude in her chest was overshadowed by a new, sharper focus. This was no longer just about the Terexari or Earth. It was about something deeper, something she couldn't quite grasp yet, but could feel stirring beneath the surface. They were at war, yes, but there was more at stake than survival. Perhaps, for the first time, something was worth fighting for. Segment 7. The Silent Rebellion. The cold hum of the comms network was the only sound in the otherwise quiet briefing room. Outside, the sky was dark, the threat of war hanging over Earth like a storm cloud. But in the room itself, the air was thick with the weight of an unspoken decision. Elias sat behind the command desk, flicking through reports, each one more grim than the last. Virell stood at the edge of the table, her posture rigid, betraying the storm of thoughts that churned beneath her calm exterior. They had been forced to make a choice. The mission parameters were clear: intercept the incoming Terexari fleet, use Earth's unpredictable environment to create traps, and slow their advance long enough to reinforce the planet's defenses. But then came the unexpected. Virell had excelled in offering insight into Terexari strategy, suggesting clever misdirections, feints, and counterattacks that used the planet's geography against their invaders. Earth's military was no longer relying on brute strength, but on guile and strategy, and it was working. Too well. Elias, against every ounce of military protocol, had elevated her role. Instead of keeping her in a position of technical assistance, he had quietly placed her at the head of planning for their counteroffensive, taking the mantle of leader, a title she had never once sought. Now, as the night wore on, Elias knew the consequences were near. He'd done it without approval. He'd placed a Terexari commander in charge of Earth's defense strategies, a move that was not only highly unorthodox but potentially treasonous. The higher-ups had already been in contact, demanding she be removed from command. The door clicked open. A subordinate officer stepped inside, their posture stiff with formality. "Commander Ward, you're needed in the council chambers immediately." the officer said, eyes darting quickly to Virell before looking back at Elias. Elias nodded slowly, setting aside the datapad with a soft click. He looked at Virell. No words were exchanged between them, but the tension in the room was palpable, the consequences of his actions hanging between them like a forbidden truth. He stood up, his voice low. They're calling for you to be reassigned, back to basic duties. Virell didn't flinch. I knew it wouldn't last. Elias hesitated for just a moment. This wasn't about protocol. This wasn't even about military procedure. It was about something far more dangerous, loyalty to each other and to the decisions they had made together. Don't go, he said quietly. Stay. She raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. You're risking your career, Elias. More than that, you're risking Earth's future. Let them come after me, he replied, his voice firm now, resolute. You've done more to protect this planet than anyone here, and I won't let them drag you back into the shadows. You deserve more than just a desk job. Virell's eyes softened, just slightly. The cold, defensive shell that had surrounded her for so long was beginning to crack, ever so subtly. You're putting yourself in danger, she warned, but there was no anger in her voice, only a strange, unspoken understanding. I know, Elias said, his gaze unwavering. But sometimes the only way to survive is to fight for what's right, even when it means breaking the rules. There was a moment of silence, and for the first time since their alliance had begun, it wasn't filled with suspicion, resentment, or cold duty. It was a quiet understanding, a flicker of mutual respect. I'll go with you, Virell said, her voice calm, but there was a warmth there now, a strange sense of purpose. But if we're going to do this, we do it together, Elias nodded. Together. As they left the briefing room, the weight of their decision settled over them like a quiet storm. Elias knew the risks, but there was no turning back now. Not when Earth's future and their future hung in the balance. Virell's fingers hovered over the cracked, flickering screen of the ship's terminal, the remnants of her damaged systems struggling to function as they tried to reconnect. The rocky wasteland outside the shattered hull of her vessel remained silent, the cold expanse of Earth's landscape stretching out beneath the veil of a bruised sky. The weight of failure pressed on her chest, but it was nothing compared to what she was about to uncover. The encrypted files had been almost impossible to access. The system's fail-safes triggered the moment the crash began. Yet Virell's mind was a weapon, sharper than any blade. The last vestiges of the Terexari code ran through her, turning every challenge into a puzzle. She bypassed the protocol encryptions one by one, her frustration rising with every heartbeat. The ship's AI groaned, a low, warning hum that filled the still air. She ignored it, desperate for answers. Then it unlocked. Fragmented pieces of data fell into place like shards of glass. Images, coordinates, stuttered audio, and a single chilling truth. The crash had not been an accident. Her own people had orchestrated it. The realization hit her like a physical blow, her breath catching in her throat as her mind struggled to process the evidence laid bare before her. Her command council, the ones who had sent her on this mission, had sabotaged her vessel's systems. It was not an enemy they had feared. It was not the humans. It was the Trexari Purist faction, the most radical group within their empire, determined to end any hope of peaceful coexistence between her people and Earth. A single file flashed on the terminal. The Purists had decided the treaty was a disgrace. The idea of uniting with humanity, of accepting their place in the universe as equals, was anathema to everything the Purists believed. In their eyes, humans were nothing more than a contaminant, a corrupting force. Exterminate the threat, the file read. Ensure her failure. Make the humans question their trust in the Trexari. Her heart pounded, fury rising like bile in her throat. They had betrayed her, not just her mission, her honor, everything she had ever fought for. The very people she had trusted had condemned her to death, hoping that her failure would sever the fragile bonds she had helped form with Earth. She punched the console in frustration, but it was no use. The screen had already begun to fade again. She couldn't fight her emotions, the rage, the betrayal, the horror that she had been sold out. The Purists had been using her as a pawn all along. No, this was worse than betrayal. It was a calculated attempt to drag her into the depths of dishonor. And the worst part? It might have worked, but she refused to let it. The humans had trusted her, and she had trusted them in return. No matter how broken she was, no matter the odds, she could not let this deception go unanswered. Not just for herself, but for everything that was at stake. Elias had been reluctant to share the archived documents with Virell. Despite the uneasy truce they had formed, despite her invaluable insights into Terexari tactics, there were things he still couldn't bring himself to reveal. But when he saw the intensity in her eyes, the same sharpness that had guided her every move, he knew she would find a way to see them. The archives held pieces of Earth's past, long buried, long forgotten. Now here in the silence of a decommissioned base under the shadow of a cold, dimly lit room, Virell sifted through the ancient records Elias had unlocked for her. The treaty, the one her people had loathed, the one that had once been scorned by the Terexari purists, was far more than a relic of dishonor. It was the key to understanding everything. At first, she had thought the treaty was a humiliating concession to Earth, a surrender to an inferior species that had somehow, against all odds, managed to defeat her people in battle. But as her fingers brushed through the brittle pages of the agreement, she began to see it differently. The treaty had been forged after the First Contact War, a brutal and devastating conflict that had left both civilizations battered and scarred. It was not a document meant to humiliate or degrade the Terexari. It had been an effort, a desperate attempt to create something that could bind two fractured civilizations, two warrior cultures, together after the bloodshed of a brutal war. As Virell read the clauses, she could feel her heart twist. The treaty wasn't a tool of conquest. It was a bridge built on the ashes of the Terexari's pride and the blood spilled by both sides. But then, with every line she read, confusion began to seep in. How had this agreement turned into something so despised by her people? How had it been corrupted by factions, twisted into a symbol of defeat rather than cooperation? The humans, despite their flaws, had never abandoned the agreement. They had never lost sight of its potential to heal the wounds of war, to build something better for the future. They had honored their part of the treaty, even as her people had slowly eroded its significance. But for the Terexari purists, the law was anathema. To them, the treaty was a symbol of weakness, a shameful compromise that had allowed the humans to survive. Virell leaned back, her thoughts racing. How could she have been so blind? Her people had lost sight of what had been sacrificed for this peace. They had turned the treaty into something that served their ego, their hatred for the humans, rather than the collective good. She turned to Elias, who had been silent behind her watching. This treaty, it was never about surrender, she murmured, more to herself than to him. It was about survival. Both sides were broken, and the treaty was meant to heal the rift, not just for us, but for both our species. Elias didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached over to the table, his fingers brushing the edge of an old yellowed map of Earth's territories. The purists have twisted that meaning, Virell. They've used it to justify their crusade against humans. But they've forgotten what it was originally about. Virell nodded slowly, the weight of it all pressing down on her. And I've been a part of that. She could feel the sense of shame wrapping around her. A part of her, the part that had been so loyal to her people, to her mission, felt betrayed by this revelation. But another part of her, the part that had begun to trust Elias, saw something else. She saw hope. Hope that perhaps, despite everything, the treaty wasn't a death sentence for the future. That if she could prove to her people that this had never been about weakness, that it had always been about a choice between survival or annihilation, then maybe there was still a way to save what had been lost. Virell stood up abruptly, her mind still spinning, but a new clarity starting to take root. I need to go back. I need to speak to the Terexari Council. Elias didn't look at her, but his voice was steady. You know it won't be easy. They'll want your head for this. I know, she replied, her gaze locked onto the horizon. But it has to be done. The storm raged outside the walls of the base, a wall of wind and fury that seemed to mirror the turmoil within Virell. She stood alone in the dimly lit hallway, staring down at the floor where shadows from flickering overhead lights stretched long and uncertain. The weight of the encrypted files she had uncovered pressed on her chest like an anchor. The truth had shattered everything she thought she knew about her mission, about her people, and about her place in this new unfamiliar world. She could no longer stand by and watch as Earth continued to be dragged into the conflict. The Trexari purists had used her, and now the only way to fix this, to make things right, was to return to her empire and expose the truth. The Council needed to hear it. They needed to understand what they had done. The treaty wasn't just a relic, it was the key to preventing total destruction. The humans weren't the enemy. The real danger lay within her own ranks. With a deep breath, she steeled herself. The base was heavily guarded, but she had seen enough during her time there to know its weak points. Elias's resistance to her every move had left her with a deep understanding of the layout, the security measures, and the routines of the personnel. She would have to move fast, be precise. She couldn't afford to fail. She made her way to the storage bay, where the skimmers were kept, silent as a ghost, her heart thumping in her chest. The sleek, compact vessels were Earth tech, crude compared to the Trexari ships she had once commanded. But they would be enough. She could get away, reach the coordinates she'd decoded from the archives, and escape before anyone knew she was gone. But the moment her fingers touched the controls, the base alarm blared to life, shattering the quiet. She cursed under her breath as the doors to the hangar bay slid open. Too late. She had been discovered. Virell wasted no time. She surged forward, climbing into the cockpit and sealing the hatch behind her. Her mind was already calculating the escape route, scanning for the slightest opening. She had to move before they locked down the entire facility. She punched the engines to life, the skimmer's thrusters kicking into overdrive as it lifted off the ground with a shrill whine. Her hands flew across the controls, but just as the craft cleared the hangar, a shadow cut through the rain-soaked darkness. It was Elias. His figure appeared, emerging from the tempest with the speed and precision of a seasoned soldier. He had been waiting for this. He knew as she did that it was the only way to truly make things right. His voice crackled through her comms, strained but urgent. "Virell, stop!" The crackle of static distorted his words, but the message was clear. She couldn't let him stop her. She had to go, had to warn her people. Her fingers tightened on the controls and she pushed the skimmer forward, the powerful engines roaring as she sped into the storm. The swirling winds whipped against the hull, and for a brief moment, Virell thought she might lose control. But she held firm, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Behind her, Elias wasn't giving up. He cut through the winds with a craft of his own, his silhouette cutting through the storm. The chase was on. Her thoughts raced, but one truth cut through the panic. Elias wasn't just trying to stop her. He was trying to save her from herself, and yet she couldn't let him. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. The storm howled around her as she drove the skimmer faster, desperate to outrun the one person who might understand her more than anyone else. Elias Ward was more than a commander. He was a mirror to her own soul, both of them trapped by their codes, their loyalties, and their unyielding duty. But she had made her choice. She was going home, no matter the cost. The storm had become a blur of rain and lightning, a tempest of nature that mirrored the chaos inside her. Virell's heart pounded as she fought the skimmer's controls, weaving through jagged canyon walls with terrifying precision. The wind screamed in her ears, the hull rattling under the pressure. She was so close, just a few more kilometers, and she would be free. She could already see the faint outline of the escape route she'd mapped, the path that would take her out of Earth's atmosphere and into open space, far from the reach of the humans who had tried to control her. But then, with a deafening crackle over her comms, Elias's voice cut through the noise. "Virell, stop! You're going to kill yourself!" It was futile. She couldn't let him stop her now. The stakes were too high. The truth she carried was worth more than any life, including hers. But Elias wasn't just a commander. He was a soldier, a survivor, and he knew the dangers of the canyon better than she did. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. Virell's skimmer lurched, its thrusters faltering as a surge of static filled the cockpit. The canyon walls loomed dangerously close, and for a split second, she thought she was going to crash. But then a dark shape cut through the rain, a flash of silver that appeared from nowhere. Elias. His craft was faster than hers, and he had been gaining on her since she'd left the base. Without warning, he closed the gap, his vehicle's engines roaring. She had no time to evade him. The two crafts collided in midair, metal screeching against metal, the force sending them both tumbling toward the earth below. Virell's pulse raced as the skimmer spun uncontrollably, its systems fighting to right itself. For a moment, she saw nothing but the world upside down, the storm's fury blurring her vision. She was losing control. Then, with a final screech of metal, the skimmer slammed into the side of a cliff, and everything went dark. Virell's head spun as she regained consciousness, her body bruised but alive. The cold, wet ground beneath her was a reminder that she was still on Earth, still trapped in a world that would never fully accept her. The skimmer was a crumpled heap of charred metal a few meters away, steam rising from its shattered remains. Her pulse quickened as she tried to move, but before she could react, she heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoing in the silence. And then there he was, Elias. His figure appeared from the storm, soaked but unharmed, his eyes fierce with a mixture of concern and anger. He reached down, his hand extended toward her, but she slapped it away with a growl of frustration. "I told you to leave me alone," she spat, her voice hoarse from the exertion. "I don't need your help. I don't need anyone's help." Elias's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening. "You're not leaving, Virell. Not like this." She scrambled to her feet, her chest heaving with fury. "You don't understand. You can't." "I understand more than you think," Elias cut in, his voice low and steady. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he met her gaze. "I'm trying to save you from yourself." She scoffed, taking a step back, eyes burning with defiance. "Save me? By trapping me here? By forcing me to stay with you? To follow your laws, your rules?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Because your mission is a lie, Virell. It's all a lie. Your people don't want peace. They want to destroy what we've built. And you're playing right into their hands." The words struck her like a blow to the chest. She staggered back, her eyes flickering with the first hint of doubt. I didn't know." "I know," Elias murmured, his voice softening. "And that's why I'm doing this. You're not the enemy, Virell. Your people are." She stared at him, the storm howling around them, the wind whipping through her hair. The anger, the rage she had clung to for so long, began to ebb. The realization hit her with the force of a lightning strike. Elias wasn't her enemy. He was right. She had spent so long following orders, so long fighting for an empire that didn't even care about her. She had been a pawn in a game, her choices dictated by a code that no longer held meaning. For the first time in days, her anger subsided. There was only confusion and fear and the terrifying uncertainty of what came next. But there was also something else, a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in years, a spark of hope. "I can't go back," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't go back to them." Elias didn't say anything at first. He just stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "Then you don't have to." For the first time since the crash, Virell let herself breathe. She wasn't alone. The storm had not relented, but inside the fractured shelter of the canyon outpost, there was an eerie calm. The wind howled outside, the rain lashing against the walls like an uninvited guest. But within the shelter, only the soft crackle of the fire filled the silence. Elias had set it up with careful hands, his movements efficient and precise despite the weariness in his eyes. He had been awake for days, working tirelessly, but now as they sat across from each other, there was a sense of pause, as though the world had stopped for a moment, allowing them to breathe. Virell sat on the far side of the fire, her body stiff, her mind racing. The heat from the flames was a welcome relief from the biting cold, but it did little to quell the turmoil in her chest. She had never been this close to another human being before, not in the way she was now, not with the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them like an invisible thread, pulling them together even as they remained worlds apart. The silence stretched long, filled only by the sound of the storm outside and the occasional crackling of the fire. Elias didn't speak at first. He simply watched her, his eyes steady and unreadable. She met his gaze, but for once, there was no challenge in it. No defiance, no judgment. Just a quiet understanding that neither of them had expected. "I didn't mean to get you caught up in this," Virell said, her voice soft, but the weight of the words was heavy. "This was never your fight." Elias didn't answer immediately. He just continued to watch her, the flickering light of the fire casting shadows across his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm. "Maybe it was never my fight," he said, "but it is now, and you're not alone in this anymore, Virell." The simplicity of his words struck her with a force she wasn't prepared for. She had spent so long running, fighting, pushing away the very things she now found herself longing for: trust, connection. But now, sitting there across from him, with the fire crackling between them, it felt as though the world had shifted, as if they were no longer enemies or commander and captive, but something else, something far more complicated. Virell shifted uncomfortably, her thoughts a chaotic swirl. She had fought against him for so long, against everything he represented. His humanity had been a barrier she couldn't cross, a weakness in her eyes. But now she wasn't so sure. He had risked everything to stop her from making the biggest mistake of her life. He had seen her for what she was, broken, lost, and still, he had stayed. "You don't have to help me," she said, her voice thick with emotion she had never allowed herself to feel before. "You don't owe me anything." He leaned forward slightly, the firelight casting deep shadows over his face. "Maybe I don't owe you anything," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean I won't help you." Virell felt something stir inside her, something she had long buried under the weight of duty and honor. It was fear and something more. Desire. The desire to trust, to believe in something that wasn't just a lie or a command. She had fought for so long, not realizing that all the while there was another fight happening within her. One she had refused to acknowledge, because to acknowledge it would mean admitting weakness. But Elias didn't look at her with pity or judgment. He looked at her as an equal, someone who had been tested by fire just as much as he had. The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled between them, the light dancing in the shadows. But it was the unspoken understanding that kept them rooted in place. And then, without thinking, Virell reached out. Her hand brushed against his, a tentative touch, but it was enough. Elias stiffened at the contact, but he didn't pull away. Instead, his hand shifted, his fingers closing around hers. The contact sent a jolt of warmth through her, but it wasn't the heat of the fire. It was something deeper, something she had never expected to feel in this desolate world. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe in something other than the code that had governed her life. Something as simple as a touch, a shared silence, and the promise of something more. But even as their fingers intertwined, the weight of their respective duties hung over them like a sword. Their worlds were still at war, and they were both still soldiers, bound by allegiances they couldn't easily escape. But in that moment, as the fire flickered and the storm raged outside, there was something between them, something fragile, but real. And Virell couldn't help but wonder, was it possible to leave everything behind for the chance of peace, for the chance of something more than duty? She didn't know, but with Elias beside her, for the first time, she thought maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying. The storm outside had become a relentless beast, lashing the canyon with fury. But inside the shelter, it was dark, save for the faint, flickering glow of a single low-burning fire. Elias and Virell sat across from each other, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. The tension was palpable, hanging heavy in the air, as if the storm itself had seeped into the very walls of the shelter. They had spoken little since their moment of unexpected intimacy, but now the silence was thick with the weight of what came next. Elias ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion lining his face, but there was something else in his eyes. Determination. Virell couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in him, the way his gaze never left her, how his posture had subtly changed. He wasn't just a human commander anymore. He was something else, something more. He was a man who had seen the truth, who had chosen a side, even if it meant breaking every rule in his book. "I've been thinking," Elias said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, steady, but it carried an edge. We can't keep running. Not from each other, not from the truth. The purists won't stop until they get what they want, and if we stay hidden in the shadows, we'll never expose what they've done. Virell's heart quickened. She had known this moment would come, but still, hearing him voice it felt like a hard slap. The decision was real now. Too real. She had no illusions left. If they acted, if they revealed the truth, they were committing treason against both their empires. And what exactly do you propose we do? Virell's voice was tinged with skepticism, but beneath it, there was something else, something close to desperation. You want us to risk everything? For what? The truth? Elias didn't flinch. For peace, he said, his voice unwavering. For the future. We reveal what happened to your ship, to your people. We expose the purists for the traitors they are. It's not just about saving Earth. It's about saving everything. Virell looked down at her hands, fingers trembling ever so slightly. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like a collapsing star. She had lived her life in the shadow of her people's expectations, bound by codes that were older than the stars themselves. And now this strange, dangerous alliance with a human, was asking her to throw it all away, to betray everything she had known, everything she had fought for. If we fail, her voice broke slightly and she hated how vulnerable it sounded. If this goes wrong, they will hunt us both, and I'll be branded a traitor to my people. You'll be nothing more than a coward to yours. Elias leaned forward, his eyes intense, locking with hers. And if we don't do this, we'll both be nothing. I don't care about their labels. I care about what we can do together, Virell. We have the chance to stop a war, to change everything. The words hung in the air between them. A promise, a gamble, a challenge. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and for a moment, all that mattered was the raw, unspoken truth that lay between them. They were in this together, for better or worse. Virell's breath caught in her chest. She had thought she understood duty, honor, loyalty, but now those concepts were slipping through her fingers like sand. What Elias was proposing wasn't just a risk. It was the end of everything she had known. And yet, as she looked into his eyes, something shifted inside her. A spark of something she hadn't felt before, a hope. She swallowed, the decision settling into her bones like ice. Fine, she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. But you're right. If we're going to do this, we do it now. And we do it together. No turning back. Elias nodded, his expression softening just for a moment before the commander within him returned. No turning back, he echoed. They both stood, moving toward the table where a map of Earth and the Turksari fleet lay sprawled out. Virell glanced at the holographic display, her fingers tracing over the coordinates. They had no time to waste. There was no room for mistakes. We'll have to hit them hard, she said, her voice now low but resolute. We need to coordinate a strike against the purist factions while also broadcasting our findings. We don't just need to expose them. We need to make them look weak, fractured. Elias nodded, eyes narrowed with focus. And we'll need to make sure we're a step ahead. The purists won't hesitate to act first. The plan was dangerous, reckless even. But as they looked at each other, there was no hesitation in their eyes. For the first time since they had met, they were no longer enemies or captor and captive. They were two soldiers, bound by a shared purpose, standing on the precipice of a new war, one where the stakes were not just their lives, but the fate of both their worlds. As they continued to plot their next moves, the fire flickered low, and outside the storm raged on, as if the universe itself was testing them. But inside there was a sense of unity, however fragile, a sense that, together, they might just be able to change the course of everything. The base felt colder than usual, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The air was thick with suspicion and the weight of the decisions that had been made in the shadows. Word had spread quickly about the plan that Elias and Virell were preparing to set into motion, and it wasn't long before the murmurs began. Whispers in the hallways, glances that lasted just a second too long, a quiet hostility that hung in the air like the scent of a storm about to break. Virell walked through the base with her head held high, but even she could feel it, the sharp eyes following her every move, the subtle isolation that had started to creep in. The human scientists who had once seen her as an enigma now saw her as a potential traitor, a weapon to be wielded. Their respect, however fragile, had begun to crack, leaving only distrust in its wake. It was a reminder that she wasn't one of them. Not really. She passed by Elias's office, her footsteps echoing in the silent corridor. Inside, Elias was already seated at his desk, his fingers moving swiftly over the console as he reviewed the data. The tension that had been building between them now seemed almost tangible, and for a moment, Virell hesitated at the door, unsure whether to go in. Yet she knew the decision had already been made. She had no choice but to walk through that door. She entered without a word, and Elias glanced up, his face unreadable. There was a sharpness in his eyes, but not the anger she had expected. Instead, there was something deeper, a quiet understanding that passed between them. "How are the preparations?" she asked, her voice colder than she intended. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not here, not now. "On schedule," Elias replied, his tone equally measured. "But we've got a problem." Virell's brow furrowed. "What kind of problem?" "Command's not happy about our little alliance," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Some are calling for your immediate reassignment. If I don't stop it, you'll be sent back to basic training with a shadow over you. A lot of people don't trust you." Virell's jaw tightened, the word trust ringing painfully in her ears. There was a time when she would have dismissed such fears, but now as she stood here, surrounded by the uncertainty of her situation, the weight of her actions began to settle deeper. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was a liability, a reminder of a war long past, a treaty long buried, and the dangerous secrets she carried with her. "And what are you going to do about it?" she asked, her voice laced with a challenge. Elias met her gaze, his eyes hardening for a moment. He knew the risks as well as the sacrifices they were about to make, but there was no turning back now, not for him, and certainly not for her. His answer was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they had both become in the past few weeks. "I'm going to fight for you," he said quietly. "Not because it's easy, not because it's popular, but because it's right." Virell's breath caught in her throat, her heart beating louder than she would have liked. She had expected many things from Elias, but not this. She had expected the coldness of command, the willingness to use her as a pawn. But this was different. His loyalty, however misplaced it might have seemed, was a warmth she hadn't anticipated. She could feel it now, pressing against her chest, urging her to trust him. "You'll lose everything if this goes wrong," she said, almost as a warning. "You don't know what you're asking. The purists will come. They won't care who you are or what side you're on. They will burn everything in their path." "I know the stakes," Elias said, his voice steady. "But I also know this. If we let fear dictate our actions, we'll lose before the first shot is fired. I'm not about to let that happen. I believe in this, Virell. I believe in us." Her heart skipped a beat. It was hard to reconcile this man, the pragmatic commander she had once deemed a symbol of human weakness, with the person standing before her now. He wasn't just leading a mission anymore. He was leading her. Virell turned away from him, the weight of the decision nearly crushing her. She had always believed that her people's code was absolute, that duty came first, that honor demanded obedience. But in the face of this human who was willing to risk everything for a cause that had nothing to do with his people, she found herself questioning everything she had been taught to believe. "Promise me you'll follow through with this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going anywhere," Elias replied with quiet conviction. "And neither are you." For a moment there was nothing but the soft hum of machinery in the background, the hum of the base, the weight of impending betrayal and shifting allegiances. Elias and Virell stood on the edge of something irreversible, something neither of them could fully comprehend. The decisions they had made, the risks they were about to take, would shatter more than just their lives. They would tear apart the fragile peace between two worlds, and whatever came next would either bring unity or destroy them all. As Virell turned to leave, something else flickered in her chest, a spark she couldn't ignore. Perhaps it was trust. Perhaps it was the beginning of something far more dangerous. But it was there, and for the first time in a long while, she wondered if they might actually have a chance. The alarms erupted across the base with a blinding shriek, cutting through the early morning calm like a blade of terror. It was the kind of sound that could paralyze a man's heart, the kind of sound that meant death was already on its way. The voice on the intercom was sharp, frantic, the kind that a soldier never wants to hear. Incoming fleet, Terexari warships, breaching exo-perimeter. All personnel to battle stations. This is not a drill. Virell's mind raced, the sharpness of the situation quickly cutting through her fog of exhaustion and fear. She hadn't expected this. No one had. The purest faction's war fleet, an armada of sleek, battle-hardened ships built for nothing but blood and fire, was now within Earth's range. The Terexari believed her dishonored, that her captivity on Earth had been the ultimate humiliation, and now they were coming to punish the planet for it. Beside her, Elias was already on his feet, his face grim but set with purpose. His eyes locked onto the radar screens, scanning the incoming vessels. The Terexari had no mercy, no reason but their own need for power. The fact that they were willing to destroy Earth over her, it both sickened and terrified her. "They don't understand," she murmured, her voice rough. "They think I've been dishonored, that I've betrayed them." Elias didn't take his eyes off the flashing data, his mind already calculating the odds. "Then we'll show them they're wrong. But first, we need to survive." As the fleet drew closer, the reality of the situation settled over them both. Earth's defenses were formidable, but they were nothing compared to what was coming. Communications with outposts had already begun to break down. Terexari jamming systems were forcing the humans into a defensive posture they couldn't hope to hold for long. The fleet's advance was calculated and efficient, like the inevitable strike of a hammer against an anvil. And Earth was the anvil. Virell clenched her fists, her mind reeling. She was their only hope, no matter how deep the betrayal ran, no matter how much she hated the thought of facing her people again as a prisoner. But this time, her loyalty wasn't just to the Terexari. It was to Elias, to the people who had taken her in, and to the truth that needed to be seen by both sides. "The battle isn't just about surviving anymore," she whispered to herself. "It's about uniting them before they tear each other apart." The tension in the command room was palpable. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity, heavy with the weight of impending doom. Earth's military was scrambling to prepare for the oncoming storm, but there was something they all knew. If they didn't break the cycle of misunderstanding, if they didn't make the truth known, Earth would burn beneath the shadow of Terexari retribution. Virell stood beside Elias, the holographic interface casting flickering blue light over her battle-worn face. The ship's broadcast system hummed to life, its once sleek Terexari design now mismatched with Earth's rugged, patched-together tech. She had no idea whether her words would reach the Terexari Council, but she knew they had to try. Elias' voice cut through the charged silence. "We can't afford mistakes. This is our one shot." He pressed a button, and the transmission began. The room fell quiet, every officer holding their breath, watching as two worlds teetered on the precipice of war. The flickering image of Earth Command appeared first, the leader of the High Command, a figure of stern authority. Behind him, the Terexari envoy, a proud, regal figure in their armor, gave a curt nod as the message began. The words that Virell had crafted in her mind, over and over again, spilled from her lips like an urgent plea for reason. "I stand before you as both the subject and the messenger of a truth that no one here has yet understood. The crash was no accident. It was no failure of the stars. It was sabotage, a deliberate attempt by the Terexari purist faction to discredit me, to undermine the fragile peace we had barely begun to understand. And now they come to destroy both our worlds in their misguided vengeance." Her eyes flicked to Elias, whose gaze remained focused on the screens. His features were tight, but there was a sense of determination in the way he stood, unwavering as the weight of history pressed down on them both. As the transmission continued, her voice quivered, but she held firm. "The treaty that binds us is not one of dishonor, but of survival. It was written after a battle that nearly ended both our civilizations. What I have endured is not disgrace, it is a pathway to peace." On the other side of the galaxy, the Terexari elders were watching. Their faces flickered across the screen, unreadable, their ancient eyes betraying nothing. In the distance, the war fleet hung in orbit, waiting for the signal to strike. The ancient council leader's voice broke the silence, his words cold and distant. "You speak of peace, Commander Virell, yet you wear the chains of humiliation." Virell's hand tightened into a fist. The belief that her servitude was dishonor had always been a festering wound in her heart. But now, standing at the precipice of war, it was more than just personal. It was the last bastion of hope. "You mistake loyalty for shame," she said, her voice rising with a fury that surprised even herself. The council leader's image flickered, his tone icy. "The earth shall answer for your weakness, Virell." With that, the transmission ended. Silence consumed the room, as every officer waited for a response that might never come. Elias turned to Virell, a weary acknowledgement in his eyes. The next steps were uncertain, but they had done what they could. And now the true test would begin. The room trembled, a low hum resonating through the base like a warning. Virell's eyes were glued to the data stream, her mind racing to understand what had just unfolded. Her pulse quickened as a chilling realization dawned on her. The orbital satellite, a relic from the first contact war, was reactivating. "Elias!" she barked, her voice sharp with urgency. "The AI, it's waking up!" Elias shot a glance at the overhead screens, where the dormant satellite now flickered into life, its targeting systems rebooting with an eerie precision. His breath caught, and his fingers flew across the console. He had read about the AI, built to defend Earth from any alien incursion. An autonomous war machine, its programming hardened by decades of conflict, now interpreting the peaceful transmission as an invasion. "Override protocols, now!" Elias shouted, his voice thick with adrenaline. The base's systems were a patchwork of human ingenuity, thrown together in haste after Earth's fragmented history of war and survival. They had never anticipated a threat like this, but as the first missile was launched, an unsophisticated but terrifying signal of war, Elias had to make a choice. The AI had no concept of alliances, no understanding of the words Virell had just spoken. It simply saw enemies and it was preparing to destroy them. The missile's engines lit up, streaking toward the Tigrisari fleet with a blinding flash. Earth's defenses, already strained, scrambled to respond. But it was clear, Earth couldn't stop it alone. And if they couldn't neutralize the AI soon, the planet would be embroiled in a war far beyond what they could survive. "Virell, we need a way to halt the satellite's targeting system." Elias's voice broke through her thoughts, desperation creeping in. Her mind raced, thinking back to the knowledge she had gleaned during her time as a warrior in the Tigrisari fleet. Ancient, obsolete AI systems, like the one now in play, relied on outdated algorithms, struggling to adapt to the present. "I know how to slow it down, but I need access to the central uplink." "We'll have to reroute the satellite's communication lines," Virell said, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the best course of action. Elias's lips curled into a grim smile. "Then we'd better move fast." But as the minutes passed, the tension in the room mounted, and a feeling of doom pressed down on them. The satellite, now fully reawakened, began firing on both fleets, Tigrisari and human ships alike. Each blast from its cannons felt like an echo of the past, a reminder of the dark days when the first contact war had nearly torn the universe apart. The AI, in its twisted logic, could only see the present conflict. It couldn't tell friend from foe. Outside the base, the sky was beginning to crack open with flashes of fire and the distant sound of orbital chaos. The fate of Earth, of both worlds, hung on a precipice. "Damn it," Elias muttered, his hand gripping the console as he prepared for the worst. The entire operation hinged on getting to the AI's central control node, a place so deeply embedded in the Earth's defense grid that it was nearly impossible to breach without major casualties. But they had no choice now. "Prepare the team," Elias ordered, locking eyes with Virell. "We're going in." Elias stood frozen for a heartbeat, the hum of the base's systems around him suddenly distant, swallowed by the weight of the decision he had just made. His fingers hovered over the command console, trembling with the gravity of his next move. "This is it," he muttered to himself, eyes scanning the faces of his team, each one as resolute as the next. They had no time to waste, but Elias knew the next step would be one of sacrifice. If they didn't move fast enough, Earth, and possibly the entire human race would be lost. The AI was a ticking bomb in space, and every second was precious. "We're running out of time," Virell said, her voice steady but edged with urgency. "We need to take action before the satellite system reorients itself to fire again." She stood beside him, a sharp, calculating presence. Her eyes, still sharp despite the chaos unfolding around them, glinted with resolve. But even she understood the peril of what they were about to do. The central uplink was buried deep within the base's military systems, and gaining access to it wasn't just a matter of tapping in codes or brute force. It required the AI's own systems to be momentarily disabled. Elias's gaze never wavered. His mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the risks, calculating the odds. The satellite could be neutralized, but only if they diverted its targeting systems long enough for a disabling strike. And to do that, Elias would have to stay behind, manually rerouting the base's AI uplink. "Leave this to me," Elias said quietly, the weight of his words falling between them like an impenetrable wall. His tone was calm, too calm, the way a man spoke when he had already decided what was necessary. Virell's eyes narrowed, a mixture of concern and disbelief flashing across her face. "We can't afford to lose you, Commander." Elias shook his head, his expression hardening. "The moment we hesitate is the moment it all ends. I need to stay here, control the uplink. I'll make sure the satellite's targeting is rerouted long enough for you to disable it." His gaze softened for a moment, but his resolve was unshakable. "If I don't, all of this, the alliance, the peace, will mean nothing." Virell opened her mouth to protest, but Elias was already walking toward the command station, issuing orders in quick, clipped tones to his officers. The tension in the air was electric, but he refused to let the weight of his decision shake him. He would do what was necessary to save both worlds, even if it cost him his life. "You're not doing this alone," Virell said, voice low but fierce as she stepped up beside him. "I'll stay with you." He shook his head once more, turning to face her. "You're needed out there, Commander. You're the key to uniting them, Trexari and humans alike. You need to lead them now. I've already made my choice." Virell's jaw tightened, but she understood. It wasn't just strategy that had brought them together. It was this shared understanding of sacrifice, of what it meant to be a leader. And sometimes leadership meant making the impossible choice. "Then let's make sure you're not a martyr," Virell replied, her voice tinged with something deeper now. Something that spoke of mutual respect, of something more than just alliance. Elias gave her a final grim nod, his gaze hard as steel. "Get to the uplink. I'll buy you the time you need." With that, he turned back to his work, his hands moving with precision as he keyed in the commands. Behind him, the base's personnel scrambled, preparing for the final phase of the mission. The next few minutes would determine everything. Elias had made his choice, but now he only prayed that the gamble would pay off. The seconds felt like hours as Elias worked, fingers flying over the console, calculating, rerouting, ensuring every fraction of a second mattered. Outside the command center, the warfleets loomed, the tension in the air palpable. Every breath felt like a countdown. But in the silence, Virell was already moving. She didn't need to be told twice. The weight of the moment was no longer just on Elias's shoulders. It was on hers too. She had spent too many lifetimes as a warrior to hesitate now. The warfleet was only the beginning. The alliance, the fragile peace, it all hinged on the next few moments. She stormed into the central communications room, her presence like a shockwave as she glanced over the gathered human and Trexari forces. Eyes turned to her, wide with uncertainty, disbelief. There was no longer time to question. They were on the precipice, and only unity would save them. "Listen to me," Virell's voice rang out, commanding and unyielding. Every ounce of her warrior's heart filled the room as she turned to face the assembled forces, humans and Trexari alike. "We are not enemies, not today." Her words cut through the tense atmosphere, the space between her and the soldiers crackling with the kind of tension that only the cusp of war could create. But beneath the military rigidity, something shifted. Virell could feel it, a stirring of something more. Her blood boiled, and with it, the remnants of centuries of battle pride, honor, and undying defiance surged through her. This battle is not just about survival, she continued, eyes locking with Elias's for a brief moment. It's about proving that we are more than our bloodlines, more than our creeds. Today we fight not for glory, we fight for unity. Her words echoed through the room, and she could see it in their eyes, the flicker of belief. The Taraksari warriors, trained for bloodshed, understood this truth at their core. Humans, too, were beginning to see it, the potential of what they could accomplish together, beyond the cultural barriers, beyond the hatred that had once defined them. Virell raised her arm, her voice booming with authority. We strike together, Trexari and human. We destroy the satellite, or we all fall. There will be no turning back. The soldiers were silent for a heartbeat, before one by one, they began to nod, their faces hardening into determination. It was the same old feeling of battle, but there was something new now, a common cause, a shared goal that transcended the divide. Ready your weapons, she commanded. Prepare to move out. She turned to face Elias one last time. The weight of the choice had been his, but now the command was hers. And despite all the history between their people, there was something unmistakably clear in this moment. Their destinies were intertwined, for better or worse. With a final look, she turned, leading the charge. Behind her, both Terexari and human forces followed, hearts ignited by the strength of her war cry. Today they were no longer enemies. The ground shook beneath them as the combined forces of Terexari and humans charged forward, their feet pounding in unison. The sound of weapons being readied echoed across the battlefield, a testament to the fury that burned in both armies. They had no choice now. There was no room for hesitation. The satellite in orbit, an ancient weapon from the First Contact War, had already targeted them both, and every second was a ticking clock toward annihilation. Virell stood at the front, her stance unyielding. The battle cries of her people mixed with the calls of humans, each voice woven together by the singular need to survive. She had reclaimed her place as a leader. For the first time, it wasn't just her Exari pride that fueled her. It was the shared will to fight alongside the humans. Shared will to fight alongside the humans. Stay sharp, she ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. Target the satellite's control center first. We disable it together, or we die together. The plan was risky, dangerous, but in this moment, there was no other option. They had already risked everything to get this far. The battlefield around them was a blur of motion. Trexari warriors, with their fluid, battle-hardened movements, wove through the chaos with human soldiers who fought with an intensity born from sheer survival. Despite the difference in tactics and history, they were making it work. The two forces were blending, adapting, learning from one another in real time. Virell's eyes scanned the sky. The satellite hung above them like an ominous shadow, its weapons primed and ready to strike again. It was a weapon of pure destruction, built for a war long past, but now it was all they had. They couldn't afford to let it fire again. Lock on, she barked as she spotted the shimmering outline of the satellite's core, a massive energy cannon mounted at its center. We need to destroy its targeting system. Now, Trexari warriors, their sharp instincts honed from years of combat, moved with deadly precision. Humans, still learning to fight alongside them, were catching up, adapting their tactics to complement the alien strategies. It was an unspoken bond, one of survival, of raw necessity. But Virell could feel it in her bones, the hope that was igniting. This wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. It was a symbol of what they had become. Allies, a united front. The first explosion rocked the ground beneath them, sending ripples through the air. A Tiraxari grenade had hit its mark, shattering one of the satellite's outer defense shields. The humans quickly followed suit, their improvised weaponry finding weak points in the satellite's armor. Virell's heart pounded as she saw the satellite's energy core flicker. It was working. The two forces were doing it, together. The next strike came from an unexpected angle. A human soldier, his face streaked with dirt and blood, launched a rocket toward the heart of the satellite. The explosion was deafening, a roar that sent shockwaves through the battlefield. The satellite's power flickered, then collapsed, its weapons suddenly falling silent. For a moment, everything stood still. The smoke cleared. The satellite had been neutralized. The victory didn't come with cheers, not yet, but it came with something far more profound. Silence, relief, and the quiet realization that they had won. Together. Virell stood in the center of the chaos, chest heaving with the exertion of battle. She looked over at Elias, who had emerged from the command center, covered in grime but alive. His face, usually so reserved, now showed a look of grim satisfaction. They had done it, and in doing so, they had forged a bond that went beyond just the mission. But the war wasn't over, not yet. Their real battle had only just begun. "Are you ready to face what comes next?" Elias asked, stepping toward her, his voice low but steady. Virell met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "We face it together." And in that moment, she knew the path forward was theirs to shape. The fire they had endured, the chaos of the battlefield, had forged something stronger than just an alliance. It had forged a new future, one where both Terexari and humans could fight side by side. A future built not on war, but on shared strength, mutual respect, and unity. They had made it through the fire, and now they would rise together from the ashes. The sterile hum of the medical machines was the only sound that filled the room, the quiet rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos of the battlefields. Elias lay in a bed, his body bruised, battered, and broken from the battle he'd almost sacrificed himself for. His face was pale, but the deep rise and fall of his chest told the story. He was alive. That was enough. Virell stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the Andes' jagged peaks in the distance, their snow-capped tips piercing the sky. She had never seen such beauty, never truly appreciated the fragility of life until now. The mountains were a far cry from the barren war zones she had known, and yet they both spoke of resilience. Her armor felt heavier than ever, the weight of everything she had endured pressing down on her as she turned toward the bed. Elias's eyes fluttered open, his breath coming shallow but steady. He saw her first, and a ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. "You look different," he rasped, the words coming with a strain. Virell's heart tightened at the sight of him, more human now than she had ever allowed herself to consider him. He wasn't just the commander she had once resented. He was a man who had faced the abyss, sacrificed for a cause larger than both of them. I didn't expect you to make it," she whispered, standing at his side, her gaze softening. The cold warrior she had been felt so distant now. The walls she had built were crumbling, piece by piece. "You should have known," Elias muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not done yet." Virell's hand lingered near his, then gently clasped it, the touch speaking volumes. She didn't need to say anything. He understood. This wasn't just survival. This was healing. For both of them. The grand hall of Earth's Senate had never felt more surreal to Virell. She had spent her life in the high-pressure corridors of the Terexari Empire, navigating political games and ancient rituals. Now, standing at the podium before an assembly of humans and Terexari alike, she felt the full weight of history pressing on her shoulders. Before her, the ancient servitude law lay crumpled on a ceremonial table, its power shattered by the joint declaration of both Earth's Senate and the Terexari High Council. Virell had been part of the battle, but this victory was different. It wasn't just a political shift, it was a rebirth. As she spoke, her voice carried the echoes of centuries of conflict, but also the promise of something new. "This treaty was forged in blood, in misunderstanding, and in fear," Virell began, her words deliberate, cutting through the air like a blade. "But today we stand together, not as enemies, not as conquerors, but as equals. The past is dead, and in its ashes we will build a future based on cooperation, mutual respect, and shared purpose." Her words were met with a mix of applause and hesitation. Not everyone was ready for this change, but enough had made their peace with the new reality. The Terexari elders were silent, their expressions unreadable, while the human delegates were still reeling from the fact that the law they had once known no longer held sway. "This is only the beginning," she continued. "We will forge a new path, together." The Terexari ceremonies of release were no more. Rituals that once humiliated their enemies, now rendered meaningless. In their place, a new code was born, one that Virell would help to write, alongside Elias and countless others who had risked everything to see peace take root. The message had come directly from the Turksari Empire. Virell was to return immediately. She could be promoted, placed at the head of the newly formed military command, or she could face punishment for her actions. It was a choice that seemed simple, even inevitable, but Virell wasn't the same person who had once obeyed the rigid laws of her people. She stood before a crowd of dignitaries from both worlds, the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. Elias was by her side, his presence both a comfort and a reminder of the price they had paid for this moment. The room fell silent as she took a step forward, her voice calm but resolute. "I choose neither crown nor chain," Virell declared, her words slicing through the tension in the room. "I reject the ancient ways that seek to bind me. I choose to live freely, not as an instrument of war, but as a person who can stand as an equal to the people of Earth and the Turksari." The implications were immediate and profound. Her decision shook the foundations of the Turksari Empire. She would not return to her old life. No promotions, no honor, no further obligations to a system that had once defined her. Her identity, forged in war, was no longer hers to claim. She had redefined herself in the fires of battle, and now she would define her future on her own terms. The accolades that followed the victory over the Turksari purist faction were both overwhelming and hollow. Elias had been hailed as a hero, a symbol of the hope that peace could one day triumph over war. Yet as the celebrations continued, he found himself increasingly alienated from the world he had helped to save. He had always been a soldier, a commander who had known how to fight, but peace? Peace was something else entirely, and it was never what he had wanted. He had done his duty, but now it was time to let go. "I've served my purpose," Elias said to Virell one evening, as they stood together beneath the stars, the weight of the world heavy on their shoulders. "Don't you think you've earned the right to rest?" Virell asked, her voice quiet, though there was no judgment in her words. He nodded, his gaze distant. "I've fought for peace. Now I need to walk away from it." His resignation from command was a quiet act of rebellion, a refusal to turn peace into something political, something bureaucratic. He didn't want to be a part of the machine that turned heroism into policy. He wanted to remain human, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. And so, Elias Ward, the soldier who had saved Earth, walked away from command. The announcement was made before a vast audience, a collective of human and Turksari leaders standing side by side. In front of them, a future was born. "We are no longer separate worlds," Virell declared, her voice strong and clear. "Today we establish the Interstellar Concord, a coalition dedicated to exploration, discovery, and mutual understanding." Beside her, Elias stood, no longer a commander, but a symbol of something far more profound. Together they unveiled plans for the first joint deep space vessel, a hybrid of Turksari and human technologies. The ship would be a beacon of what could be achieved when two species, once enemies, worked together towards something greater than themselves. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt possible. As they left the stage, their hands brushed against each other, a quiet moment, filled with the weight of everything they had overcome. And though they could not know what the future held, one thing was clear. The bridge they had built together would lead to a new chapter, one that neither Earth nor Turksari had ever imagined. And with that, they stepped into the unknown, not as soldiers, but as pioneers. The massive silhouette of Unity's Reach loomed over the launch pad, its sleek form a perfect fusion of Turksari elegance and human ingenuity. Standing side by side, Virell and Elias gazed up at the vessel they had both contributed to, an embodiment of everything they had fought for, a bridge between two worlds that had once been at war. The ship's hull gleamed with Turksari alloy, a shimmering surface that reflected the light of distant stars, while human modular adaptability had shaped its design for a shared future. It was a marvel, one that had taken years of work, sacrifice, and trust. Virell ran a gloved hand along the smooth surface, feeling a quiet pride. She had once fought for her people's honor, for her empire's glory, but now she stood for something else, a new purpose that transcended old allegiances. Beside her, Elias's face was worn but softened by a quiet joy. His gaze lingered on the ship, his fingers subconsciously tracing the edge of the pendant around his neck, crafted from the wreckage of a battle that had almost consumed them both. The AI of Unity's Reach, semi-sentient and bilingual, spoke to them in both human and Terexari, its voice calm and assuring. The journey begins. Virell exchanged a look with Elias. Their journey together was far from over. They had survived the fires of war, and now, together, they would cross the stars. As the final test ran across Unity's Reach's systems, an unexpected anomaly rippled through the ship's communications network. A strange encoded signal intercepted from deep space, non-Terexari, non-human, pulsed through the void. Elias and Virell exchanged a sharp glance as the signal crackled across the bridge's screens. The message was fragmented, a haunting mosaic of warnings, coordinates, and a symbol they both recognized. The symbol was ancient, one that had been passed down through generations of both species as part of their respective myths. Each had thought it was just a tale, a legend, a fragment of forgotten history. But now the reality was undeniable. The message was real. The coordinates, leading to a rogue star system beyond known space, beckoned them toward an unknown frontier. Something older than their civilizations, something that had watched them from the shadows for longer than they realized. Virell stood frozen, the weight of the discovery settling over her. She had once thought their biggest challenge was peace, but now a new mystery loomed, as ancient as the stars themselves. The observation deck of Unity's Reach was quiet as Elias and Virell stood side by side, looking out at the glittering canvas of stars. The view was breathtaking, but it was the shared silence between them that carried more weight. So much had changed, both for them and the universe at large. Virell glanced at Elias, his features softened in the dim light, the years of conflict and survival etched in his eyes. She reached out, her hand brushing against his. The touch was simple but profound, a connection that defied everything they had once been taught. "This is only the beginning," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, as they stood together beneath the vastness of the cosmos. Elias nodded, his expression unreadable for a moment. "Maybe it's not about the end anymore," he replied. "Maybe it's about what comes next." Virell wore the combined crest of Earth and Terexari on her armor now, a symbol of their shared future. Elias held on to his pendant, a reminder of the man he had been before and the person he was becoming now. They had crossed the lines of war, of duty, of honor. But this, the quiet between them, the space between stars, was something new. A new journey. Together. Unity's Reach broke free of Earth's atmosphere, its engines igniting with a powerful hum as it ascended into the stars. A soft hum of anticipation filled the bridge as Virell and Elias stood at the helm, watching as their ship charted a course beyond their world. In the silence of the moment, a voice crackled over the intercom, a final message from their ship's AI. The words held an eerie weight, as though they were not just a declaration, but a warning. Peace forged in fire can still burn. And in the shadows beyond the stars, others watch. The stars stretched out before them, vast and unknowable. But the signal, the legends, the symbols, they were a mystery that demanded to be unraveled. As Unity's Reach turned toward the unknown, they knew that peace was only a fragile beginning. There were others in the dark reaches of the galaxy, watching, waiting, perhaps with intentions that would shatter everything they had worked for. The screen flickered and the voice faded into static. Then the screen went dark,